Hi. How is everyone tonight? All right, if I start to fade at about 25 minutes, somebody just prop me back up, okay? I'll be fine. I'll be just fine. Welcome back. If you were here last night, if you weren't, welcome. We are so happy you are here. Thank you, Bruce, for that lovely introduction. Wish I remembered some of that stuff about my life. If you were here last night, you may remember that I began by thanking Bruce and all the folks here at Grace St. Paul's who bought into this radical thing we're calling Christianity 3.0. It took some courage to suggest to me and to the rest of the church that this weekend was something we desperately needed to do if we were serious about bringing this new vision of church to the world. Tonight, someone else needs to be thanked. It certainly took courage for the group here to capture this vision and be willing to try something experimental. But they, at least, had some idea why this was so important. They've heard about this before. They've been exposed to it. You, however, came here with no such background. Though you may have been previously scarred by church, you were willing to come here and give us a chance, and I so much appreciate that. That took true bravery, and I am so grateful to each of you who are coming here not knowing anything that is going to happen and putting yourselves in that very unpredictable place. So as I thought about how vulnerable some of you have to feel exposing yourself to whatever might happen here tonight, I wondered how I could properly thank you for being so willing to do so. What I decided is that I needed to put myself in the same position as you. It only seems fair. If you are really going to trust me on any level at all, I think I need to be at least as unprotected as some of you may feel this evening. So I am going to share with you a very personal story, something that exposes me in a light that is unbecoming and embarrassing. I do this in the hopes that you will not just understand me better, but will have the opportunity to see into my soul. I also tell it in hopes that it helps us bond with one another. So if you were here last night, you know, however, that I believe context is critical to any story. So before I tell you my story, I want to tell you another one. I would like to share with you a 2,000-year-old one about one of my favorite women of all time. So, he came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone to the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" I love the little part in parentheses now. Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans. Of course not. They hated them. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying this to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where did you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well, and with his sons and his flocks drank from it?" Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming down here to draw water." Jesus said to her, "Go, call your husband and come back." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband." "What you have said is true," the woman said to him. "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father seeks as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming. When he comes, he will proclaim all things to us." Jesus said to her, "I am he, the one who was speaking to you." Just then his disciples came. They were astonished that he was speaking with a woman, but no one said, "What do you want?" or "Why are you speaking with her?" Then the woman left her water jar and went back to the city. She said to the people, "Come and see a man who told me everything I have ever done." I'm going to cut right to the personal story next. This is a story that is kind of painful for me to tell. And in fact, occasionally it still wakes me up at night. Anyone in their right mind would keep this tale to themselves, but all of you deserve to hear it. And if anything I said last night or tonight is going to impact you in any way, I believe you need to accept me at the deepest level. I know of no better way to allow you that opportunity than to splay myself open in front of you and pray for the best. So here we go. Years ago, in a land far, far away, in both distance and culture, I sat alone in an artificial, tinny restaurant on Christmas Eve. I waited there uneasily, having a feeling in the back of my mind that something, I was not sure what, was terribly wrong. Finally, though, my wife walked in the door, and I felt relieved. That relief, however, lasted only a few moments. She sat down and ordered her dinner with an over-the-top cheeriness, and I knew at once that something was dreadfully amiss. I will never forget the positively pleasant look on her face when, without the slightest emotion in her voice, she turned to me and said this: "I'm leaving you. Our marriage is over. It's a done deal. Nothing that you say or do is going to change my mind." Now, we were supposed to be getting on a flight in 2 hours to fly back east to be with our families for Christmas. To my great shock and horror, she got on that plane, and we flew back there, she as if nothing had happened. She said nothing to anyone about our conversation and acted like everything was just peachy. In the meantime, I vacillated between walking around like a zombie and bursting into uncontrollable sobbing. The pain of being rejected and the depth of the loss I was experiencing was more than I could bear. But it was so much more than that for me. There was one thing I was certain about my entire life. Divorce would never be in my vocabulary. I would do, I always told myself, whatever was necessary to make it work no matter what. I was so naive. It was part and parcel of who I was as a human being, though. It was at the center of my religious upbringing. If I got divorced, I would be a non-person. I would have no idea who I was. The possibility was so foreign to me that I could not envision what to do next. Once the initial shock let go of me, I found myself in a continual depression. I did not eat. I did not sleep. I was in the deepest malaise. If I had to describe what I felt, I would say it was nothingness. But as time went on, I realized that I did feel something. It was not as much sadness as it was humiliation and embarrassment. Christ had always been central in my life. Church had always been central in my life. But suddenly, I was in a completely different relationship with my church. For the first time in my life, I didn't want my church and my religion. I needed it. I desperately needed it to help me get past the pain and awful gnawing inside me. I also needed it to lift me out of the quicksand that was engulfing me. I needed it to lift me out of the isolation, the loneliness, and especially my overwhelming feeling of unworthiness. I never needed anything more in my entire life. So I literally begged my parish priest to help me. And this is what I heard. You have grievously sinned. You have screwed up. You have no one to blame but yourself. He then made it clear that he wasn't going to lift me out of anything. He made it clear that divorce meant not only an end to my marriage, but a divorce from my church. In desperation, I sought out another priest in another town, 120 miles away, someone who didn't know me. But he was even more callous, telling me that though I was a young person, I must never be involved in another relationship in my entire life. To do so would be to live in the gravest form of sin. And I was living in enough sin already, thank you very much. At the time in my life when I so desperately reached out for a hand, my church threw me out in the street like the trash that I felt like. And in so doing, they ripped out of me the only hope I had left, that my faith could get me through the worst moments in my life. I already told you that I grew up in the church and it was part of the fiber of my being. They might as well have ripped the heart out of my chest, because that is exactly what it felt like. Some intense, lonely wandering followed, during which I felt ostracized from the world. But very, very slowly, after much more pain and humiliation, it would be my faith that would eventually save me. A faith that I discovered despite what my church told me. A faith that I discovered in that first story you just heard. The truth is, I never really understood what was happening in that odd tale of an unknown woman finding Jesus at the community well. But when I experienced for myself a tiny fraction of what it is like to become the Samaritan woman, that story changed me at the core of my being. In fact, when I directly felt the Samaritan woman's pain and humiliation on a deeply personal level, the entire Gospels opened up for me on a level I had never understood before. I realized that I am greatly influenced by the fact that this gospel saved me, but with the exception of Jesus himself, I believe the Samaritan woman at the well to be the greatest hero in all of the Gospels. How ironic, then, that we never even get to know her name. That is part of the brilliant methodology that the author of the fourth Gospel uses to help us grasp the magnitude of her exclusion. I was alienated from my wife and my church, but this nameless woman, she is excluded from everything and everyone. So let me apply a little bit of that biblical context we talked about last night. Middle Eastern antiquity is an age and a culture where women were not allowed to eat with men, only serve them. It is a time when holy men did not speak to their own wives in public. This is a time when a group of Nicodemus's friends, called the bruised and bleeding Pharisees, got their name because they closed their eyes whenever they saw a woman, causing them to walk into walls and the like. That's true, but that's just the beginning. This particular woman is a Samaritan, a curse word in first century Judaism, a word that's not a whole heck of a lot better even today in the Middle East. Samaritans were and remain in some circles half-breeds. In the eyes of a first century Jew, Samaritans did not even worship the same God they did. They were despised and hated at a level far surpassing what we see today between Shiite and Sunni Muslims. That's why the disciples are so incredulous when they find Jesus talking to her. To top it all off, not only is she excluded because of her race and gender, but she is also what we used to call a fallen woman. The gospel does not make it clear whether she was divorced from all of her previous husbands or whether they died, but Jesus does point out that she is presently living with a man not her husband. The real indicator that this woman is a big-time sinner, however, is the fact that she is coming to the well at noon. Respectable women came in groups in the morning and in the evening. The well was the place where they gathered to catch up on the local news. This woman goes to the well at noon because she has been excluded from that community, and also because she is the one the others are all talking about. This woman is rejected by everyone, including her own people. But as we know, despite all this, Jesus breaks every code in both his religious and cultural upbringing and actually speaks to this woman. Not only does he speak to her, but they have the longest recorded conversation in all of the Gospels. No wonder the disciples are so shocked. But it's not just the length of their conversation that convinces me that something monumental is happening in this story. It follows in the Gospel of John right after the tale of Nicodemus. It is not difficult to see why John put these stories back to back. This story at the well is about someone who is as far as possible away in every sense from the well-respected, honorable gentleman Nicodemus. You may remember that in the Nicodemus story, he comes to Jesus in the dark of night. But Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at noon with the maximum amount of light possible. We are being told that this story is the opposite of the earlier one in the gospel, when Nicodemus, the good guy, the honorable guy, didn't have a clue as to what Jesus was saying. That story is the tale of the most respected and included guy in the world, who is totally in the dark. But this story is of someone seeing the light. That person, of course, is the one rejected and humiliated by all. When for the first time in my life I found myself relating to the Samaritan woman rather than Nicodemus, I too finally saw the light. Those years of pain and humiliation fell off of me like a snake shedding his skin, when it finally hit me that even though everyone else abandoned the Samaritan woman, including her church, Jesus never did. More than that, once the Samaritan woman realizes that Christ will not ostracize her or abandon her, no matter what she has done, no matter what has been done to her, she is emboldened. Not only will she become one of the most enlightened individuals in all of the Gospels, but she will also become the very first evangelist. She will bring Christ's message of inclusion of all to her own people. She will change the way her own church once excluded people from their midst. She will break down the barriers that her church and culture put up that humiliated so many. It is not just what Jesus does today that provides us a model of how we are to care for others. The Samaritan woman teaches us the same lesson, convincing all of us that we too can do this. Now, it was not easy for me to share with you my personal story of embarrassment. I know that it is possible that some of you may write me off as a result of hearing that story. But when I finally related my own story to this gospel, I realized that there is no choice but to share such tales with each other. It is only through my own shame and discomfort that I was able to finally grasp what is really going on in the Gospels and what church is supposed to be all about. I can tell you that without that happening to me, I don't think I could have been a priest. And let me tell you what that church is supposed to be all about, what I discovered. Let's start with a clue. It doesn't have anything to do with belief or following rules or creating dogma that all of us must follow. Christ, my friends, doesn't give a flying flip about your dogma. This is totally and completely about being the Samaritan woman for each other. It is all about being so inclusive that we seek out and find everyone who is being ostracized and oppressed in our world and bringing them to a church that treats them like royalty. That is what each of us must do with our own humiliating moments. They offer us the opportunity to truly experience the wonder of Christ's presence in our personal lives if we only allow them, and they can teach us how to be that presence for an entire world that desperately needs it. When I heard the story of the Samaritan woman in light of my own story, I knew that there was only one thing I could do. I knew that I must do everything in my power to create the church of the Samaritan woman. What that woman does for us today is not just give us a model of how to interact with Christ in our lives, but also how we should be relating to each other. Jesus begins by knocking down all the cultural and religious barriers that have been put up to separate this woman from her world. That is quite an act of compassion, and the woman knows it. But for what happens next to occur, the Samaritan woman also has to put herself out on a limb. She has to disclose to Jesus the other reasons why he should not be drinking from her cup. So instead of bristling when the conversation turns personal, she tells Jesus the beginning of her own humiliating story. I have no husband. And because of that bold act of disclosure, Jesus reveals that he knows the whole truth about her. When Jesus tells her more about herself, she suddenly learns a lot more about him. She learns that he is not just a Jew who has reached out to her, even though his religion tells him to throw her out like trash. By being willing to disclose herself, she experienced the Jesus beyond the man. She has an experience of the divine at that very moment. And then Jesus discloses even more of himself to her. I know that the Messiah is coming, she says, and he says, I am he. That is the first time Jesus discloses that to anyone. He hasn't told his disciples, and he didn't tell Nicodemus in the story of the inclusive person. He chooses instead this sinful woman whose religion, culture, and people had abandoned. And by so doing, she discovers who she is. Not the person the world saw, not the person they told her she had to be, but instead a full human being with dignity and honor. That is our model for being in relationship with each other. By having the courage to share our own misfortunes and humiliations with others, as the Samaritan woman does with Jesus, we become closer to those around us. When we open ourselves to others, they tend to put down their guards, and then they share with us, creating a common bond between us. That is exactly what happens with Jesus and the Samaritan woman, as each discloses more about each other. Their relationship becomes the most intimate one in all of the Gospels as a result. It is the courage that the Samaritan woman has to admit her own failures that allows all of this to happen. What a magnificent model for how we should speak to each other to create intimacy between us. And as I think of the closest relationships I have with people today, the ones that I would not give up for anything, I realize that they were all born in the intimate act of sharing Samaritan woman details of our lives with each other. This is, of course, also how we create a church and a world full of inclusion. Everyone likes to think that they are open to accepting others into their churches and lives, but inclusion does not mean you are welcome here even though you are different from us. Inclusion is all about the realization that all of us are welcome because all of us are the same deep down. Bringing about the kingdom of God is all about having everyone realize that we are all fallen women, that we all mess up on a regular basis, that it is in fact only through our failures and our embarrassments that we truly experience the wonder of God in our lives. And the way that we do that is when we have the courage to disclose to others our humiliations, just as the Samaritan woman does with Jesus today. We have a name for that kind of inclusion here at Grace St. Paul's. We call it promiscuous hospitality. And it is meant for everyone. Get it? The story of the Gospel of John cannot be reduced to one sentence or even one narrative, as so many have tried to do. Its length and breadth takes us on a journey to God from conversion to enlightenment. But if you had to choose one story to capture that journey's most consequential elements, it would be difficult to make a better choice than the woman at the well. In it, we learn that the God of the Bible will never throw us out like trash. We learn what the church is really called to be, despite what others have made it. We learn that no matter what we have done, no matter what has been done to us, we can still experience God in the midst of our lives and change everything for ourselves and the world around us. When we realize that Christ shows us who we are by exposing us to who he is, then we too will have the courage to disclose our inner selves and in so doing bring dignity and strength to others who have been disenfranchised. The Samaritan woman at the well, therefore, is our model for ministry and inclusion. We do our utmost here to not only respect the dignity of every human being, but to honor them. We also do our best to not just talk about this, but walk the walk. For example, I am proud to say that last year the Episcopal Church approved a blessing rite for same-sex couples. It is a major step for a worldwide church to pass such a resolution. But here at Grace St. Paul's, we just did a same-sex wedding. That act, of course, is illegal in the state of Arizona and in our greater church. But I would suggest that we had no moral or ethical choice in the matter. How could we possibly live into the lesson that Jesus teaches us with the Samaritan woman if we have one sacramental rite for one set of people and a different one for another? The opposing argument that homosexuality is sinful because the Bible deems it so is, in my mind, impossible to justify in any way. There are 8, count them, 8 references to homosexuality in the entire Bible. By contrast, the word money appears 133 times, just the word money. There are 8 of them, and I would argue that none of those 8 references have anything to do with a same-sex monogamous relationship, because that didn't exist. I would venture to say that there is nothing in the Bible that speaks of homosexuality as we refer to it today. Absolutely nothing. Not to mention the fact that Jesus never says a single word on the subject. Just like people who have used the Bible to justify exclusion of another, the same can be done to condemn homosexuality, and of course plenty of people have done that. But that is only possible if you read the Bible as if it was written to people in 21st century Tucson. That is not only silly, but it also does great damage to the sacredness of our text. We must interpret what Jesus says and do it for our own situation, or we will continually repeat the mistakes of the past. That is exactly why Jesus gets so upset with some of his Pharisee friends. They can't interpret the Torah for their own situation. And when you take the length and breadth of Jesus' message across the Gospels, there is absolutely no doubt who Jesus would be standing with today. I think he might be in that picture. That is why we broke the law. And that is why we will keep doing so until all of the world fully includes GLBTQ people in every way. Sorry I didn't get arrested, though. Would have made it a heck of a lot easier. Our social ministries here are also all about lifting up the Samaritan woman and honoring her. Our food pantry is all about bringing hope to people who have little. Our shower program is about bringing respect to people who feel cut off from society. In fact, we have an entire social service ministry to reach out to anyone who is in financial, emotional, or spiritual need of any kind. The first goal in that program is to make each person feel as accepted and loved as the Samaritan woman is made to feel by Jesus. It is not just socially that we push for full inclusion. If we are to be true to the woman at the well story, if we really believe that everyone who has been hurt by another church deserves to be embraced, then we must be a place where we accept and honor people from every religious tradition, especially those with whom we disagree. That lesson was taught to me so well by my former spiritual director, Dr. Al Painter. Here's Al down at the bottom. I say former because Al died just this past June, 5 days short of his 99th birthday. Though his body began to fail him at the end, he remained one of the most brilliant thinkers I have ever experienced in my life, right up through his last couple weeks on earth. Al was a former American Baptist pastor and a teacher of world religions. He was a classmate of Houston Smith's at the University of Chicago 70 years ago. 70 years ago. Houston and Al were two of a kind. Houston became the famous one, becoming the world's foremost authority of world religions. But make no mistake about it, my friend Al was every bit as brilliant as Houston, continuing to amaze me with his original philosophical and religious ideas right up through the last time I spoke with him. Sitting on my desk is a single phrase that Al said to me in one of our last conversations. I've been thinking, he said to me, about a better way to express the essence of what we call God. How about this, Steve? God is that innovative activity that makes up life. Yeah, he came up with them all the time. As a teacher of world religions, Al agreed with his friend Houston on many things, but disagreed with him on a few too. Here's one of Houston's thoughts with which Al totally agreed. Houston was asked if one faith carries the lead, or do the parts share in counterpoint and antiphony where not in full-throated chorus? His answer, we cannot know. All we can do is try to listen carefully and with full attention to each voice in turn as it addresses the divine. That is exactly how Al taught as a professor. In what now seems like a lifetime ago, he invited me to come to his class on world religions at Dixie College in St. George, Utah. As you might guess, situated as it is in the land of Deseret, well over 90% of that class was made up of very young, very blonde, very naive LDS students. I will never forget the look of utter shock on their innocent faces as they slowly began to see Mormon history in the context of all world religions for the very first time in their lives. Living in the sheltered environment of rural Utah, many of them had managed to get to that point in their lives believing that there was Jesus, followed by 1,850 years of religious vacuum, whereupon Joseph Smith was born. Al had set for himself in that class what I told him was an unattainable goal. What he wanted to have happen at the conclusion of each session covering a specific world religion was for every student in the class to be able to say, I can understand why someone would choose to be that religion. Al was such a good teacher that to my great surprise, he was almost successful in reaching that goal, even with those students. But of course, there were always a few that just could not go beyond anything outside their own religious upbringing. I particularly remember a male student who at the end of the session on Hinduism latched on to that tradition's contention that religions are but different languages through which God speaks to the human heart. The tenderfoot lad stood up and said, "You mean that Hindus don't believe that their religion is the only true path to salvation?" And Al, so very patiently, explained that Hindus believe that claiming salvation as the monopoly of any one religion is like suggesting that God can be found in this room, but not the next. Why, our student wanted to know, would anyone choose a religion that did not state that it was the one true and only correct faith? That day, Al asked me to field that question too. Little did I know that that question would haunt me throughout my ordained ministry, right up through yesterday. As people have learned that we do not preach a gospel of exclusion here, I have continually been asked that very same question. If you really believe that your way is not the only path to God, why in the world did you become a priest? If you do not believe that the only way to God is through your brand of Christianity, then why do you choose to be a Christian at all? Another thing that you will learn about this tradition and me is that as a non-dogmatic faith, as people who do not think that you must believe a certain way to attain God in your life, answers are rarely simple for us. And that's very difficult for a lot of people. I get that. We are, and I am, a person of ambiguity. That was the last question I was asked at my last commissional ministry. Can you handle ambiguity? Living in that ambiguity is central to who we are, and I know that it is uncomfortable for many. But to live in the land where you truly learn from other traditions, philosophies, and science, you must be in a place where your world can never be black and white. But when it comes to the question about why I choose to be Christian, I can answer in one non-ambiguous word: incarnation. This whole crazy idea that God would choose to become a human being is a totally different concept than has been espoused in any other religious tradition. I know that there is this tendency within accepting churches and religious circles to suggest that all religions basically teach the same things, have the same tenets, and that in the end, all of the world's great religious traditions are basically the same. It is a lovely and interfaith kind of thought that feels very good. But here is another critical thing that you need to know about us. We don't believe that. We are not universalists. We do not think that Hinduism and Christianity are really the same thing deep inside. We do not think that Confucianism has the same overarching principles as us. We do not believe that fundamentalist evangelicals are the same as us, that we just need to understand each other better. We are different, and that is a wonderful thing. That is, in fact, how our faith evolves. By learning from one another, all of our faith traditions become deeper, fuller, and more saturated with meaning-making. The Dalai Lama has taught me so much about detachment and how to love one another. Muslims have instilled in me a deep sense of the holy other. And my fundamentalist evangelical family and friends have taught me so much about faithfully following the tenets of the Bible. The truth of the matter is that all of the world's great wisdom traditions teach very different things. For us, that begins with the notion of God becoming a human being. I choose to be a Christian and an Episcopalian for very specific reasons. Most importantly, the concept that God became one of us, lived with us, cared for the poor and the oppressed with his own hands and feet, and lifted up the Samaritan woman at the well, teaching each of us firsthand how to bring dignity and love to every human being and every part of creation. This whole incarnation thing goes even further. We tell the story of a God who is not remote and separate from us, but actually lowers God's self so far as to become a human being. No other wisdom tradition suggests any such thing. For many, the idea remains appalling, outrageous, and sacrilegious. To make matters so much worse, our story goes on to tell us that God didn't just become any human being, but God chose to come into the world as a poverty-stricken lowlife, born outside a backwater town not unlike Nogales, in a barn, no less. His unwed teenage mother places the newborn infant into an animal feeding trough. Now, if you are the least bit offended by that image, then you can begin to understand why Christianity is so different than any other religious tradition. A God who would become a low-life human, a God that would become part of God's own creation. There is nothing that could have been more irreverent than to suggest that God would become one of us. What disgusted others about this story in its original form is exactly the reason I embrace it with my entire being. Our God, the God of Christianity, is radically different than any understanding of God ever imagined before this day or since. The God that we can experience is so unbearably close to us that our God is actually one of us. The God who was almighty and all-powerful came to us as a human baby. Before incarnation, it was understood that we access God by following a rigid set of 613 laws that brought us to God and God's mercy. But within the tradition of Christianity, we discover a God who comes not to the people who followed the rules, but instead to those who didn't and were kicked out of society for it. That God will grow up to continually push this vision of religion, one where the leader lifts up the most despicable and rejected person in the first century world, a remarried Samaritan woman. In the small world in which each of us lives today, we would be idiots to not take advantage of the great opportunity we have to learn from each other's faith traditions. All of us evolve as individuals, and our churches become stronger places of inclusion when we immerse ourselves in the ancient faiths. We do that regularly here at Grace St. Paul's in many ways, including a Thursday evening service called Spirit Now, where we have lessons from all of the great wisdom traditions of the world. We draw from those sacred texts also in our Sunday worship occasionally. All of that brings us to a deeper faith and a deeper understanding of others. That is why we would never attack another tradition. All of the great religious traditions are valid paths to God, and we learn from all of them. But what you will also never hear in this place is some sort of vague sense of universalism that suggests that all religions are the same. We are unapologetically Christian and unapologetically Episcopalian, fully embracing an incarnational God who brings everyone to the table without exception. Incarnation is the reason I am a Christian. It is also the reason I go to church. Yes, God can be experienced everywhere in the natural world. You know I totally believe that. But the message of incarnation is that first and foremost, we discover Christ by being together. Christ becomes known to us in the midst of community. When we are with each other in our joys as well as our pains, our celebrations as well as our sufferings, something happens. God is born in the midst of us. And suddenly our joy becomes more complete and our pain starts to melt away. Here are the most profound and important words I have ever heard. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Among us. That is a God I can embrace. A God that embraced a Samaritan woman. a God that has taken me through the most difficult moments of my life, a God that loves us more than we can fathom. It is this God that made the Samaritan woman at the well the greatest hero in all of the Gospels. Because of that, we know that we too have the power to live in full dignity and bring that dignity to everyone else. Jesus teaches us how to do this by creating a church and a world where no one is ever excluded for any reason, where we spend our days and our nights eliminating every form of denigration and bringing dignity to all, where we empower everyone in our midst and make sure that no one is ever exploited again. Don't ever tell me that words are not important, that actions speak louder than words, because tonight, with nothing more than words, Jesus and the Samaritan woman change the world. We can do the same thing. Let us, therefore, recreate that ancient vision of the church. Let us be the place where we are always overwhelmed by a God who would become one of us, so that God could be in relationship with every Samaritan woman. Let us be the place where we too can not just accept every Samaritan woman, but where we can also learn from her and become intimate with her. Let us be the place where we continually learn from all of the great wisdom traditions, so that our faith is always evolving and always being recreated. And let us be the place where in the most difficult moments of every person's life, they know they can always come and always be embraced, loved, and cared for, and respected in the most intimate way imaginable.